Welcome to Trending One Podcast. Today, we dive into the Iran and Israel conflict, exploring the rising tensions, key players, and global stakes. Stay tuned as we break down this critical geopolitical issue.
Okay, so you brought us a ton of stuff about the Iran-Israel conflict, and, those images of missiles over Israel are really something else.
Yeah, it's pretty unsettling to see, frankly.
Yeah, and it's easy to get caught up in all the headlines, with everyone talking about World War III, but
Right.
we really need to kind of take a deep breath here and cut through the noise and try to understand.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We need nuance here.
Yeah.
This is not some, far-off conflict. This is something that impacts everyone, and understanding the nuances of this is key.
I think that's a good point to start off with,
Yeah.
because we're seeing retaliation on a scale that really we haven't seen in decades.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's scary, frankly.
It's terrifying.
And you're talking about that October 1st attack,
Right.
over 180 ballistic missiles. That's not just an attack.
That's a statement.
Right.
That's a very scary statement.
It's a huge statement, and I think before we even get into that, can you give us some context? Because this wasn't Iran's first move, right?
No, not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Back in April, we saw the first direct Iranian attack on Israel since 1991.
Wow.
That's right. Like
Well-
you're talking about during the Gulf War, when Saddam Hussein was lobbing missiles into Israel to find a parallel. You have to go that far back.
1991, I was like, I don't even think I was paying attention to geopolitics back then. I mean,
Right.
what was I doing?
I think I was just learning the ABCs.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, but what was the catalyst this time around for Iran to do this?
So the April attack was a direct response to an Israeli airstrike in Damascus.
Okay.
Israel claimed that it was a Hezbollah-linked target, but the strike killed 7 Iranian officers, including a high-ranking official.
Wow.
So a serious escalation. From Israel's perspective, they're saying, well, we're going after terrorists.
Yeah.
But from Iran's perspective, hey, you're hitting us now.
So it was a direct hit on them, not even just their allies.
That's exactly right.
And so is that what you see as the reasoning for them to actually retaliate?
Yeah, I mean, it really highlights the interconnectedness of these conflicts.
Yeah.
Because for years, Iran has been engaged in what we call proxy wars, where they support groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit, this whole idea of a proxy war. So essentially, they're playing a game of chess, but it's not their pieces on the board, it's other countries and other conflicts.
Yeah, it's a good way of putting it. They are basically, these groups become extensions of Iranian foreign policy.
Hmm.
It allows them to exert influence and pursue objectives without directly engaging in overt warfare,
Right.
with their own military at least.
Right, so it allows them to have some deniability.
Exactly, plausible deniability.
Right, and so, but this time, they stepped onto the chessboard themselves.
That's right.
Why the shift from supporting these proxies to launching a full-on attack?
Right, so there's a couple different reasons. I mean, one is what we just talked about, which is that April strike was seen as a direct attack on Iran, not just their allies. So it may have just signaled a change in their calculus of acceptable risks.
So it's more of a, you hit us, we hit you back.
Exactly.
Rather than having a proxy do it for them.
You hit us directly, we're coming at you.
Exactly. And we also shouldn't underestimate the symbolic importance of these attacks.
Right.
This wasn't just about causing damage. This was about sending a message to Israel and to the world.
Right.
They targeted a major military base in the Negev. They hit the headquarters of Mossad, which is Israel's intelligence agency. These were calculated moves designed to demonstrate their reach and their capabilities.
It's like something out of a movie.
It really is.
And speaking of capabilities, how is Israel even defending against this?
Right.
Because we've all heard about how advanced they are in terms of their technology, their defense technology. We hear about the Iron Dome all the time.
Right.
How effective are those systems against something of this scale? That's where it gets really interesting. So Israel has poured resources into building this multi-tiered defense network. The Iron Dome, which you mentioned, is kind of their first line of defense, and that's mainly against short-range threats, the kinds of rockets that Hamas uses.
Right. And we've all seen those videos of that thing in action. I mean, it's almost hard to believe it's like Star Wars or something.
Yeah, it's incredible, right?
Yeah.
Intercepting rockets midair.
Yeah.
But it comes at a cost.
Right.
Each interceptor missile costs about $50,000.
Wow.
So you multiply that by hundreds, even thousands of rockets.
Yeah.
And you start to see the financial strain that this puts on even a country with a strong economy like Israel.
Right. So it's effective, but it's costing them a fortune to actually deploy it.
And that's just for the short-range stuff.
Right. What about these longer-range missiles that we saw with the October attack? Is that where the Iron Dome reaches its limit?
Exactly. That's where David's sling comes in. That's designed to counter those medium to long-range threats.
Okay.
And then there's the big daddy of them all, the Arrow system, and particularly Arrow 3.
Okay.
This is their top-of-the-line defense against ballistic missiles. It can even hit targets outside the Earth's atmosphere. We saw that in action back in April.
Wow.
So it's an incredibly advanced system.
So they've got these cutting-edge systems.
Right.
But they're also going up against just a barrage of missiles. I mean, can they even achieve a 100% success rate?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the answer is no.
Yeah.
No defense system is foolproof.
Right.
Even with all that technology, there are inherent limitations.
Yep.
First and foremost, the financial burden is immense.
Mm-hmm.
We just talked about Iron Dome interceptors at $50,000 out. David Sling interceptors, those cost about $1 million a piece.
$1 million each.
And then you get to the Arrow system, and those interceptors, you're talking several $1 million each.
Oh my gosh.
So defending against this isn't just about having the technology.
Right.
It's about financial endurance as well.
It's like a game of chicken,
Exactly.
but the stakes are incredibly high.
Absolutely. And especially with Iran developing even more advanced weaponry.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, how do you even keep up with that? Because you're right, we're spending millions of dollars to defend against this, and they're developing even more and more advanced things. What was it you mentioned earlier, hypersonic missiles?
Yeah, so Iran has been working on weapons like the hypersonic Fata missile. This thing can move at 15 times the speed of sound. It's incredibly difficult to intercept even with Israel's advanced technology. So, defending against this new generation of weaponry poses a whole other set of challenges for Israel.
Yeah, I mean, it's like we're talking about this sci-fi arms race, but this is the reality for people who live in that region.
Yeah.
And it's easy to get caught up in the technology, the missile specs, but there's a human cost here that we can't ignore.
Absolutely. We cannot lose sight of that. Since last October, over 41,000 Palestinians have lost their lives in this conflict.
That's
a staggering figure.
It's unbelievable.
And behind each number is a family torn apart, future extinguished.
Yeah, 41,000 lives. It's hard to even grasp the sheer scale of suffering behind that number. And it's not just the immediate casualties, right? The ripple effects of this conflict, they spread far and wide.
Exactly. The psychological trauma, the displacement, shattered economies.
Mm-hmm.
These are all consequences that linger long after the missiles stop falling.
Yeah.
And it just feeds this cycle of resentment and anger that makes peace that much harder to achieve.
Yeah, it's like this terrible echo of history. And one of the sources you shared was a statement by the Oscar-winning director Jonathan Glazer. And it really struck me. He spoke out against using the Holocaust as justification for violence against others.
Yeah.
And I thought that was such a powerful statement.
It is a powerful statement.
Yeah.
And it gets at the heart of this moral crisis that this conflict represents.
Mm-hmm.
And, Glazer dedicated his life's work to exploring the horrors of the Holocaust.
Mm.
So he more than most understands the dangers of perpetuating cycles of hatred and violence.
It makes you question, can there ever be a justification for inflicting that level of suffering on another people?
Right. It's a question we all have to grapple with.
Yeah.
And it's a very personal question as well. But to go back to your earlier point, yes, the ripple effects of this conflict go far beyond the immediate region.
Right.
For example, on one of the pieces you shared mentioned India's position on this conflict, calling for dialogue and diplomacy.
Okay, and I was going to ask you about that actually, because I need a little help understanding that. Why is India's stance so significant in this?
Yeah, so India is in a very, interesting and delicate position geopolitically.
Right.
Because they have strong ties with both Israel and Iran.
Okay.
And they also have strong ties with many Arab nations. So they have to walk this very delicate diplomatic tightrope.
Right.
But that also means that their position carries weight.
Oh, okay.
So when they come out and they advocate for a peaceful resolution, they're not just taking a moral stance. They're actually trying to prevent this conflict from spiraling into something even more destructive, something with global consequences.
It's a reminder that peace, or the lack of it, has a ripple effect too. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East.
Exactly.
And so as we try to wrap our heads around this incredibly complex situation, I mean, where do we even begin to look for a path towards peace?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? And, with decades of mistrust and bloodshed, it's easy to feel hopeless. But one of the sources you provided, I thought, offered a very poignant reminder. It was a quote by Mahatma Gandhi.
Okay.
He said, "An eye for an eye ends up making the whole world blind."
Wow, it's such a simple statement, but in this context, it's incredibly profound.
Yeah.
What does an eye for an eye even look like in this conflict? I mean, is it more lives lost, more cities reduced to rubble?
Yeah, that's exactly it. This cycle of retaliation just perpetuates the suffering. If we truly want peace, we need to break free from this eye for an eye mindset. It demands this monumental shift in perspective, a willingness to see beyond the cycle of violence.
But how do you even begin to have that conversation to bridge those divides when both sides feel so justified in their anger and their pain?
It's not easy, that's for sure. But it has to start somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Diplomatic channels, however fragile they may seem, need to be kept open.
Yeah.
And it's not just about governments negotiating. It's about fostering dialogue at every level between communities, between individuals.
Right.
Peace building is not just this top-down process. It has to come from the ground up as well.
Yeah, it sounds like a long shot, but what other choice is there really?
You're right, there isn't. We have to amplify the voices that are calling for peace, that are calling for de-escalation. And critically, we have to acknowledge the underlying issues, the injustices that are fueling this conflict. Peace isn't just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice.
That's a really good point. It's not just about stopping the missiles, it's about addressing the root causes of the conflict itself. Which brings us back to the complexity of this whole thing, right? Because it's like we've been saying, this isn't just about two countries, it's this whole geopolitical web that we're talking about. And you mentioned earlier the Sunni-Shia divide, and to be honest, I kind of need a refresher course there. How does that play into all of this?
Right, so it's a centuries-old divide within Islam, going back to a dispute over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
And today it often gets simplified as like, oh, it's just a religious difference, but it goes much deeper than that. This divide influences political alliances, social structures, even economic policies across the entire region.
So it's not just about religious doctrine, it's about power and influence and who's in charge.
Exactly. It's about who holds the reins of power.
So how does that then tie into this conflict specifically between Iran and Israel?
So you've got Iran, which is a predominantly Shia nation vying for power with Saudi Arabia, which is the leading Sunni power. And this rivalry plays out in countless ways, proxy wars, economic competition, diplomatic maneuvering. And then into this already volatile mix, you introduce the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Right.
And it creates this powder keg where any spark can ignite a much larger explosion.
And then everybody kind of gets caught in the blast, right? It's not just contained to those two countries or even that region.
Everyone gets pulled in.
And one of the sources mentioned India's cautious stance on this and their push for diplomacy, given how complex this is, what makes their roles so significant.
Well, like we were talking about before, India has to walk this very delicate line. They have strong ties with both Israel and Iran, and with a lot of Arab nations as well.
Right.
So their voice carries a lot of weight. So when they come out and advocate for peaceful solutions, they're not just making like a moral stand, they're actually trying to prevent this conflict from dragging the entire region, even the world, into chaos.
It really does underscore that this isn't just a regional conflict. It has global implications.
Yeah.
The actions of these countries, the choices they make, they have consequences that reach far beyond their borders.
Absolutely. And it's why finding a path to peace is so crucial, not just for the Middle East, but for everyone.
And as we kind of start to wrap up our deep dive here, I'm left with this question that I think one of the sources raised, and it's kind of a sobering thought. Who profits from this conflict?
It really is a sobering thought. While national security is definitely, a driving factor here, are there other, less noble motivations at play? We're talking about, a multi-billion-dollar global arms trade.
So there are those who benefit financially, at least from perpetuating this cycle of violence and fear.
Yeah, as unfortunate as it is to say, that's the reality of this situation. There are entities out there that profit from conflict, which is why it's so important for all of us, listening to this, to stay informed, to question the narratives that we're being fed, and to demand better from our leaders.
To remember that behind every headline, behind every missile launch, there are human lives hanging in the balance.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We throw around these numbers, these statistics, but these are real people with real lives and real families, and we can't forget that.
And while we've talked about a lot of heavy stuff today, remember, understanding this stuff is the first step towards taking action.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, as they say.
That's a great note to end on. To our listeners out there, as you're learning about this conflict, don't just consume the headlines, question them, analyze them, and stay engaged. Because ultimately, peace isn't just the absence of conflict, it's the outcome of a choice.
That's right.
And that choice, in its many forms, belongs to each and every one of us. That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.